Hi, it's Toronto immigration lawyer Max Chaudhary. I wanted to discuss some simple and exceedingly complex elements related to the renewal of a PR card or permanent resident card application. So what I want to talk about briefly is first the minimum requirements. Typically, those are to accumulate 730 days of physical presence in Canada within the 5 years from the date you're submitting the application. This can be proven through, well, the most obvious one is by physically being inside of Canada. And the alternatives are if you are accompanying a Canadian spouse outside of Canada. And the third element or alternative would be for if you are working full-time for a Canadian-based employer. So as you can probably infer, the latter two, Canadian spouse or working full-time for a Canadian business, are the more complex elements in a situation when you're renewing a PR card. However, I don't want to make difficulties exclusively confined to those types of PR card renewals. In fact, if you did have the minimum amount of days, but for example, perhaps you have an exceedingly large amount of entries and exits to and from Canada, then arguably in situations such as those, you would accumulate travel records such as numerous passport stamps, and those could inevitably lead an officer to scrutinize that PR card application more thoroughly, which may cause some inherent delays. So this is the kind of thing which you may want to get professional representation, because a professional such as us at Chaudhary Law Office would be able to make the presentation as optimal as possible and to try to make the case more easy to scrutinize when an officer has to be tasked with looking at the PR card application and the supporting documents. So I'll touch upon the exceptions to the physical presence requirement of 730 days briefly. So the other one is accompanying a Canadian spouse outside of Canada. As I've indicated, this is a more complex aspect to a PR card renewal, because then an officer would reasonably want to look at the travel records of the Canadian spouse and to see if the travel records actually match, because you have to be accompanying a Canadian spouse, which means being with them when you are outside of Canada. For example, perhaps the Canadian spouse is employed and you are accompanying and living with the Canadian spouse while she is employed. But again, passport stamps, etc., matching records for you, the PR card renewal candidate, as well as your Canadian citizenship spouse, would have to be scrutinized. An even more complex aspect is if you are relying on the substitute for 730 days based on working for a Canadian company. One thing to keep in mind is that an officer, to excuse you from having the minimum 730 days on the basis of working for a Canadian employer, must be satisfied that you are working full-time outside of Canada for the Canadian employer. And working full-time, or proving that you are working full-time, may involve myriad different ways of proving that, different types of evidence. That might be things such as evidence of what you've actually been doing. That might mean communication with the Canadian office, getting instructions, looking for leads in the case of some kind of business related to promotion outside of Canada. Evidence of interaction such as email communication. Maybe there is a triangle of communication between the Canadian office and you and a potential client or lead outside of Canada. There may reasonably be an expectation that the Canadian business has expenses, a bank account, records, showing that it is intentionally operating with the goal of trying to make a profit inherently there would be a great deal more complexity for that kind of PR card renewal application. So let's say you've applied and you've submitted the application. Oftentimes, at least from our vantage point, what some people do is they've lodged the application and then they leave and they get the impression that their PR card renewal application is assured because at the time they submitted it, they did meet the 730 days, or they did work the requisite amount of days for a Canadian employer, or they did accompany their Canadian citizenship spouse. So the unfortunate aspect is sometimes when a PR card application has been lodged, there are delays, and then the person has left Canada, and they cannot return to Canada because they do not have a valid permanent resident card. And what that means is that they may apply for a travel document application. It's not going to be slam dunk. It's not going to be successful, this travel document application, if the basis for that travel document application is that the candidate did meet the requirements for PR card renewal before they left. In fact, in the absence of some kind of humanitarian, compassionate element, then that travel document application would be refused, and the PR status of the person would be refused, despite the fact that when they lodged the PR card renewal before they left, they did meet the requirements for renewing the PR card. So clearly some kind of caution is required, and one aspect of this is to make sure your PR card application is complete and has the best possible documentation to prove your basis for the PR card renewal. If you're seeking advice about a PR card renewal, or have filed a PR card renewal and have been enduring some delays, contact Chaudhary Law Office. Thank you.